Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Administering VMware ESXi Server Security. In this lesson, we'll start off with the basics of vSphere security. I'll talk about the different types of logins that you'll have on an ESXi host versus over on a vCenter server. After covering the different types of authentication, I'll talk about the default vSphere security roles, and then I'll show you how to combine those roles with ESXi users and groups, as well as Windows Active Directory users and groups, to create permissions. I'll talk about how those permissions are applied in the vSphere virtual infrastructure inventory and how that hierarchy is important. From there, I'll give you an overview of what VMware vShield does and how it could help you secure the virtual infrastructure before I end the lesson with proper security of guest virtual machines in vSphere. So with that, let's get started. When it comes to administering security in the virtual infrastructure, one of the most logical questions you start with is, how do you log in? How do you log in? Where do you log in? And who do you log in as? Well, let's talk about user accounts first and authentication. So ESXi server, your physical servers, have local Linux-like accounts. For example, the administrative account is called root. And then vCenter, let's say that it's installed on your Windows server, like it traditionally would be before the VCSA, it uses the Windows Active Directory authentication accounts because that Windows server should be a member of the Active Directory domain. So there, the default administrative account is the Windows Administrator account. So you've got ESXi with root, you've got vCenter with administrator. If you use the vCenter Linux appliance, it can be used to authenticate through Windows Active Directory, and I show you how to do that in the lesson for the VCSA. However, by default, it's got those same Linux-like accounts, so the default account on the VCSA is root. Now, it's recommended to use Windows Active Directory users and groups to define permissions to virtual center objects. It's a great way to lay out the role-based administration of your virtual infrastructure, and then you can administer it completely from Windows Active Directory. And that's exactly what I'll be showing you how to do in this lesson. Now, to dispel any other security myths or questions, first off, all vSphere client communications are encrypted. So you've got encrypted communication between the vSphere client and the vCenter server. That traffic should be secure going across the network. If you're using the vSphere web client or you're using the web interface talking to the VCSA, that's the vCenter server appliance, all those should be using HTTPS. They should also be encrypted. You can use VLANs to segment service console traffic, really to segment any sort of traffic for the virtual infrastructure. So you could have a VLAN for vMotion, a VLAN for backups. You could have a VLAN for fault-tolerant logging traffic. I think that's really outside of the scope of this lesson, but someone who's interested in network security may be wondering that, hey, how do VLANs work with vSphere? Well, you can use VLANs to segment out different types of traffic, just like you may already be doing in your data center with traditional physical servers. Now, once you connect to the vCenter server, you'll find that users and groups, be them Linux users and groups or Windows users and groups, those users and groups can be assigned roles in the virtual infrastructure. So roles are assigned then to objects in the vSphere infrastructure. Those objects could be virtual data centers, they could be ESXi servers, virtual machines, folders, whatever type of object you want to assign a role to, you can. So when you combine the user and group with the role, that's actually called a permission. Now, by default, only root can log into ESXi, and Windows Active Directory admins on vCenter can log into the vSphere client. That's just the default within vSphere. Of course, that assumes that vCenter is installed in Windows. Like I said earlier, if you're using the VCSA, then the default login there is root. So you've got root, you've got administrator, but you really want to get beyond that. Of course, you want to change those default passwords like the root default password, but you really want to get beyond just using root and administrator. You want to use your own name. That's the proper security best practice, because then when you log in and log out and other admins log in and log out, that's all recorded. If someone stops a virtual machine or powers off your production virtual machine, that will be recorded in the log. So you've got security logs, and those security logs, you don't want to just have administrator on them. You want to have the actual real person's name. So Windows Active Directory is the best way to keep track of that, because most likely everyone in your organization already has a login in the Windows Active Directory. Now, it's not possible to run vCenter for Windows on a Windows Active Directory domain controller. They have to be separate physical servers. When you combine the roles with the users and groups and create permissions, there's no need to log out and back in. They take effect immediately, and permissions are inherited in a hierarchical manner, just like alarms. So if I assign a permission, let's say to an ESXi server, by default, all the virtual machines under that ESXi server will inherit the same permission. So remember, back to my security days when I was studying for my CISSP, remember the principle of least privilege. That's what the POLP stands for there. So in security, the principle of least privilege means that you shouldn't assign anyone access to something that they don't absolutely need access to. In other words, if all they need is access to, let's say, power on and off or reset a virtual machine, then you should just assign them those privileges at that particular level. You don't want to just give them full access to the virtual infrastructure. You don't want to just give them full access to administer an ESXi host that virtual machine's on. You only want to define what they absolutely need access to, the least privilege that allows them to do their job. So remember that when you go out and start defining these roles and permissions and privileges. I was talking about the vSphere security roles. So there's a number of default vSphere security roles. You'll see those when we go into the vSphere client. And those roles are listed right here. No access, read-only administrator, and then there's other sample roles like virtual machine power user. So say you had a SQL admin, he wanted the right to be able to power on and off the SQL server through the vSphere client. You could assign the virtual machine power user role to him, let's say, and he has those privileges. But you might want to look at that role and see, maybe he just needs virtual machine user. You just have to check out these sample roles and see. If the sample roles don't fit what you need them to do, you can create your own roles. So the only roles that you have to have are no access, read-only, and administrator. Then from there, you can create whatever roles you want to create. So now we have some tasks to perform. Let's go over to the vSphere client, and I want to show you how to add, modify, and remove ESXi users and groups, and then also how to go to the vCenter server and add, modify, and remove Windows Active Directory users and groups and map those up to roles and permissions on different levels in the virtual infrastructure. So let's go over to the vSphere client and get to work. Here we are in the vSphere client, and I've just connected to an individual ESXi server. So if you notice here on the home screen, we don't have a lot of choices to choose from, but we do, underneath administration, we have roles. So let's go into roles here. And there aren't a lot of roles either, honestly, to choose from. We do have no access, read-only, and administrator, but there's none of those sample roles that I showed you that you'll find over in the vSphere client when you connect to vCenter. So you can actually create new roles here, and you can go through and say, let's see, I want to create a VM admin role, and that VM admin role is going to have virtual machine privileges, and they're going to be able to change the state of the virtual machine, create snapshots, remove snapshots, rename, revert. Let's see, they can go to interaction. Let's say they can do all the interaction, including power on and power off. So I can say OK there. And I just created a virtual machine admin role. So you could even clone roles, or you can right-click on the roles here, and you can rename, remove, or edit them. So we have different roles that could be performed on this particular ESXi server. But we don't have any users, at least added to the virtual machine admin role. We may have users added to the administrator role. Let's go to the home screen here, and then we'll go into the inventory. We'll click on the particular ESXi server here, and then over on the right-hand side, look at the tab that says Local Users and Groups. If I click on Local Users and Groups, here's all the default accounts that are installed with this ESXi server, and probably the only one you recognize is the root account. Of course, that's the default administrative account. We can also go into groups here, and these are the default groups. So if I right-click on the root group and go into properties, the only user that's a member of the root group is the root user. I'll say cancel there. So we've got users and groups underneath local users and groups. And by the way, you won't see this tab, local users and groups, when you connect to the vCenter server with the vSphere client, and then you go and you click on this ESXi host. There won't be a local users and groups tab. Now, where the roles and the users and groups are combined is on the permissions tab right here. So if I go to permissions, there's actually 3 permissions by default that are already created. So we've got a VPX user, that has the administrator role on this object. That's the ESXi server we've selected here. We've got the DCUI user that has the administrator role on this object, and the root user that has the administrator role on this object. So those are the defaults. We've got 3 users that have the administrator role on this particular ESXi server. That's what this object is. So you can actually right-click on these and go into the properties, and you could even change the role that that user has. However, you really don't want to mess with these defaults. What I want to do instead here is right-click and go to Add Permissions. And let's say that I wanted to add a particular user and give them the virtual machine admin role. So we created this new virtual machine admin role. We can click Add Users here. We've just got our local Linux-like users. You can, however, create a new local Linux-like user. Let me click Cancel here. Let's go back to Users and Groups. Let's go to the Users view, then right-click and go to Add. And I'm just going to add a new Linux-like user. I'm going to call him David, and I'm going to set a password here. I'm not going to add him to any group, and I'm not going to grant him shell access. I'll just say OK. So now we've got this new user. Now I can go to Permissions again, right-click, click Add Permission, click Add this time, and now we've got David. We can add David. I'll double-click him, say OK. And now David has a role on this ESXi server. That's the object that we're defining this on. So if I go here, I can change that role to virtual machine admin. And then do I want it to propagate? I talked about how these roles are hierarchical and how they apply from the top down. So what that means is if we define this virtual machine admin role on the ESXi server, where we're defining it right now, and yes, propagate is checked, that means that we're going to have access, or actually David's going to have access, this new user, to perform all the privileges we gave him over here on the right-hand side with that role we created on all the virtual machines on this ESXi server. That may or may not be something that we want. If he only needs access to perform these functions on a particular virtual machine, then you shouldn't define it at the ESXi host level. You'd want to define it down on the virtual machine level, just to an individual virtual machine. To uncheck that, you would uncheck that right there. But remember, we gave this new user access to perform things on virtual machines. If we're assigning this on the ESXi server, but we're not allowing it to propagate, then we're not going to be able to perform really, I don't think, anything. I haven't tested that yet, but it makes sense that if you gave them the ability to power on and power off a virtual machine, but then applied it to an ESXi host, you're not going to really be able to do anything when you log in as that user. So let's check OK right there, propagate, yes, and I'll say OK. And now you see that David has a new role on this particular ESXi host. So now let's go ahead and open up a new instance of the vSphere client. We'll go ahead and log into the same server. I'm going to log in as David this time. Click Login. Okay, we're logged into the ESXi server. I'm logged in as David. You can see that down in the bottom right-hand corner there. And if we expand this out, let's see what we can actually do on this host. Let's say I went into configuration on the host. Then I went into networking. Notice how things are grayed out here. I can't add new networking on this server because I'm logged in as David, and he doesn't have the privileges that he would need to add new networking on the ESXi host. However, he should be able to actually right-click on a virtual machine, go to Power, and power on that virtual machine. There we go. That worked. I logged in as David using the new role that we created, virtual machine admin, and he has the ability to power on and power off any virtual machine configured on this ESXi server. Now, if we just wanted to apply this permission for David to an individual virtual machine, let's go back to our other vSphere client. And if we go to an individual virtual machine and go to the Permissions tab on that virtual machine, this is where you would do the same thing. You can see here that David has permission. It's defined on the ESX server, at the ESX server level. In fact, you can click on that, and it brings you up to the Permissions tab on the ESXi server. However, if we go back to the virtual machine, let's say that we wanted to define this just on the virtual machine. So we'll go to the ESXi server level. I'm going to right-click and then delete that permission. Then we'll go to the individual virtual machine. Notice it's gone here because we had it set to propagate down before. That's why it was here, but we deleted it at the higher level. So now I'll right-click, I'll add a permission. Again, I'll add David. Say OK. I'll set the privilege to virtual machine admin. We really don't need to propagate because we're defining this at the lowest level, the virtual machine. I'll say OK, and now you can see here it's defined on this object. So now if we log in as David, I should be able to only power on and power off this individual virtual machine. Now, before we move on and configure roles and security over through the vSphere client with vCenter, there is something I want to briefly bring up here, and that is how you can configure now an ESXi server, starting with vSphere 4.1 and later, to authenticate or access users and groups through Windows Active Directory. If I go to the ESXi server and I go to Configuration, and then down to Authentication Services, here you can see that I've added Active Directory as a directory service for this particular ESXi server, and I put in my domain, the Wired Brain Coffee Company. I had to put in my administrative username and password right here when I did that, when I added it to the domain, and now ESXi can authenticate locally to the Windows Active Directory domain controller. So if we go back to the Permissions tab here, and if I right-click and I say I want to add a new permission, and I click Add, up here under the domain where it says server, I can drop this down and I can go to the Wired Brain Coffee Company. And now this ESXi server is actually pulling Active Directory usernames and passwords. So this right here is my Windows Active Directory Administrators group. This is my Windows Active Directory Administrator account. You notice all these other accounts may look similar from when you go to an Active Directory domain controller and Active Directory users and computers. But I also have an account here under Active Directory for the user David. So I could do the same types of things I just did here using the local Linux account I created for David, but in this case I could just create the account once over in Windows Active Directory, or actually use the existing account and then add that Windows Active Directory user from the Wired Brain Coffee Company domain and give him specific virtual machine admin privileges. There we go. So now the Active Directory user David has the same virtual machine administrative privileges. Of course, the best way to administer a vSphere virtual infrastructure is to do it through vCenter, because you can configure these same types of roles and permissions across multiple resource pools, folders, clusters, and virtual data centers. So it's a much more efficient way to administer vSphere security instead of doing it per ESXi server or per virtual machine. So at this point, let me go over to my vSphere client where I've already logged into my vCenter server, and let me show you how to perform this same type of vSphere security administration. Here in this vSphere client, I've logged in as administrator from the Windows Active Directory, and we're connected to a vCenter server that's running on a Windows virtual machine in the virtual infrastructure. So this isn't the VCSA, this is your traditional vCenter server. Again, and we're logged in as admin. So if we look here underneath administration and we compare this to what we saw over on the vSphere client connected to the ESXi host, we have the same roles right here that we can configure. And when it comes to security, it's going to work very similarly, but we just have a lot more functionality here. So if we go into roles, and notice here that you have no access, read-only, administrator, and then you have all these sample roles. These samples, again, are just samples. You can use them or not, and you're also free to create your own roles here. So I can add a role, and I have all the same types of privileges that I had before, but I actually have a lot more than you just have on an individual ESXi server. But I could perform the same type of example here. I could go underneath virtual machine. I can enable interaction and the state privileges, and then I can call this VM admin role. I'll say OK there. All right, so we created a new role, and now we can go back to the home screen here and then to hosts and clusters, and it's going to work the same, where we're going to combine the users with the role to create a permission. We need to pay special attention to what level of the virtual infrastructure we create that permission, because it's going to propagate downward down the inventory tree by default if we have that propagate checkbox enabled. So if we go to the highest level here, up at the vCenter server level, notice that we have permissions, and underneath permissions by default, we have that the Windows Active Directory users have the administrator role on this object. So that's the highest level. So that's why, by default, you can log in as the Windows Active Directory administrator, or really anyone in the Active Directory domain administrators group, to the vCenter server and administer the entire virtual infrastructure because it's defined at the highest level, and you've got the administrator role, and it is propagated downward by default. But you can actually create your own permission here, and in fact, this is a great way to do it. You can go in here to add, and add underneath domain. You can select the Wired Brain Coffee Company or your Active Directory domain. You could add an individual user, let's say David in this case, the Active Directory David, say OK here, and then we could give him the new virtual machine admin role that we defined, and we could say yes, we want to propagate it down the entire virtual infrastructure. So now he would have permissions to log in using the vSphere client and perform basic, interaction and power on and power off, and take snapshots of individual virtual machines across the entire virtual infrastructure, every data center at every level. On the other hand, we could delete this here, and then we could go to an individual virtual machine or an individual cluster or data center. Let's go to the data center level here, go to permissions, and then we'll add the same permission and give him the same role, virtual machine admin. And now he could log in, but he would only have access to perform those virtual machine administrative functions or privileges across the virtual machines inside that individual or that particular data center. So there's multiple ways to do this, and again, you need to take the level that you're defining that permission at into account when you define the permissions, and also take that propagation into account. Something that many VMware admins do is they go to the highest level up here, and then they add a new permission. They click Add here to add a user in a group, and then in the Active Directory domain, let's say that they already created a new Active Directory group called vSphere Admins. And in that vSphere Admins group, they put the individual Windows Active Directory users who are actually the vSphere admins. So instead of the Windows administrator being able to log into the vSphere virtual infrastructure, only the users who are members of that group will be able to log in. And that way you don't have someone logging in as administrator and things being logged as administrator and you really don't know who it is. So let's say that we're going to do this. We'll add the vSphere admins. We'll give them the administrator role and say OK here. And now you've got the vSphere admins who have administrative privileges across the entire virtual infrastructure. Assuming you've already added users to that vSphere admins group and you can log in as them and you know who they are, you could actually go here and delete the administrator's default permission defined at the vCenter level. But I won't do that until we've fully tested that out because, again, you don't want to delete that because then you may not be able to log into vSphere at all. So in summary, that's how vSphere security works. You can create your own custom roles or use the built-in default roles, and then you can combine those roles with Windows Active Directory users and groups to create permissions. You need to make sure that those permissions are applied at the right level or the right hierarchy of the virtual infrastructure because by default those permissions will propagate down the vSphere virtual infrastructure tree. So with that, let's go back to our slides and learn more about vSphere security. Now let's move from configuring vSphere security and talk about VMware's vShield. vShield is a more optional vSphere security product, a more advanced product, and it's actually a suite of different products with only one of them being included with any version of vSphere, and that is vShield Zones. vShield Zones actually comes with vSphere 5 Enterprise and Enterprise Plus. All the other products can either be bought individually or they're part of the vShield bundle if you want to buy them all together. So let's start with vShield Zones. vShield Zones is actually a basic application layer firewall that's included in the hypervisor, and it can filter traffic between VMware virtual machines and groups of virtual machines, and between those virtual machines and the physical server or the physical network. So vShield Zones, like I said, included with Enterprise and Enterprise Plus, and with it you create these trust zones, and then you can define with vShield Zones basically who can talk to who. That's really what vShield Zones does for you. And if it happens to be included with your version of vSphere, then I highly recommend that you check it out. So if we move on and we talk about the other types of vShield that are available, starting with vShield App. vShield App, in my opinion, is a much more advanced version of vShield Zones. So vShield Zones, we said, is a basic firewall between virtual machines and zones that you create. vShield app works at a much higher level. So it's a hypervisor level firewall. It does stateful packet filtering, and it works all the way up to the application level. So you can create very advanced rules to filter specific application types in and out of your virtual machines or your groups of virtual machines. And then they have vShield app with data security. So this can actually look at the traffic flowing across the virtual network, and it can try to find network traffic that is insecure. So basically like people's social security numbers, credit card numbers, or other sensitive traffic that you don't want going out of the virtual infrastructure. Next on the list is vShield Edge. vShield Edge is a really perimeter protection virtual firewall that can protect entire virtual infrastructures from the outside world. It could be used not only internally, but it also works great in hosted environments where you have multiple tenants and they need protection from one another. Then there's vShield Endpoint, which really enables something called endpoint security. Basically, it's kind of, you can think of it almost as a programmatic interface for third-party providers that create antivirus software that can actually protect virtual machines in the virtual infrastructure without having to install clients on each virtual machine. So it enables antivirus really across the virtual infrastructure without having to enable clients, which can bring down performance. There's vShield Manager, which you can think of as a centralized management interface for all the vShield applications. And then, like I said earlier, there's the vShield Bundle, which allows you to purchase all these vShield applications at one time for a discounted price. To learn more about VMware vShield, you can check out the vShield product family webpage over at VMware.com. They've got a lot of great videos that explain more about what vShield can do to protect your virtual infrastructure. Moving on to the last topic in this lesson, I want to talk about securing guest virtual machines, because I think many times once people move Windows virtual machines into the virtual infrastructure, they think, oh, the virtual infrastructure is secure, I don't have to worry as much about security anymore. And I want to take a moment to point out that you should treat the security of guest virtual machines just as you would any other mission critical servers. And that means, let's say these are Windows servers, you need to install antivirus, keep the Windows patches up to date, application patches up to date. You want to limit login, especially by the administrator account or the root account if it's Linux. Limit software installs, because as you know, the more software you put in an operating system, the more chance you're taking that you might have instabilities. You should properly secure vSphere client access, web access, and SSH access to the individual virtual machine and to the virtual infrastructure, and then keep vSphere and ESXi patches up to date. Of course, that doesn't apply specifically to the guest virtual machines, but in general, you want to protect the virtual infrastructure and do it any way you can. So a great way to help you automate the process of keeping vSphere and ESXi up to date is to use VMware's Update Manager, also called VUM. And if you haven't checked it out, VMware has a free product called VMware Go that will even help you to keep guest operating systems up to date and even the applications inside. So make sure you check out VMware Update Manager, VMware Go, and then just keep maintaining those guest operating systems just as you used to do when they were physical servers, now that they're virtualized and running as virtual machines. And that brings us to the summary for this lesson. We started off with the basics of vSphere security, how you've got your ESXi servers and they use Linux-like logins. By default, you'll log in as root there. Then you've got your vCenter server, which typically runs in a Windows guest operating system that's a member of the Active Directory domain. So you've got your administrative account that you log in with over there when you connect to vCenter using the vSphere client. So you've got these two different types of authentication, but now there's some overlap between them. So now you can enable Active Directory authentication on an individual ESXi server. I showed you how I did that. And then you've got the new vCenter server appliance. That's the Linux-based virtual machine that runs vCenter. I've got a separate lesson on that and how that uses Linux-like authentication. So you've got a default root user account that you can log in with there, but then you can also go and enable Active Directory authentication on that. Moving on from there, how vSphere security works is you've got roles in the virtual infrastructure. Roles like administrator and any custom roles that you create, and even sample roles when you connect to the vCenter server. So you've got those roles. And then what you do is you combine users and groups, either local users and groups or preferably Active Directory users and groups, together with the roles to create a permission. that permission is then placed at whatever point in the virtual infrastructure inventory tree that you want to assign that permission at. You have the option there to propagate that permission to all objects below that object in the vSphere virtual infrastructure inventory tree. So you need to take that into account. You need to take the level where you assign the permission into account and those propagations as well. I showed you how to add, modify, and remove ESXi users and groups, how to use Windows Active Directory users and groups to secure vSphere. I showed you how to define and apply roles and permissions. I gave you an overview of what vShield is and the various pieces that make up vShield. And then we ended the lesson with proper security of VMware vSphere guest virtual machines. Thanks for watching this lesson covering administering VMware ESXi server security.